USCHO.com. This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from U.S. College Hockey Online at USCHO.com. A look at this weekend in college hockey and a review of the top news of the week.
Welcome to USCHO Weekend Review for Monday, March 15th, 2021. I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. Well, the playoffs got underway over the weekend, Jim, in a weird schedule this year. In fact, we're going to have to do a second episode this week just to get the whole weekend in. But why don't we take a look at who's still alive and some of the big things that happened over the weekend. The Big Ten, first of all, a mild upset, I guess, with Penn State beating Notre Dame. We gave them a pretty good chance when we were talking in our Game of the Week podcast last week. But boy, home ice has not been friendly to Notre Dame this season.
Well, and you watched that game. I had it on Sunday afternoon, earliest game in the country, and I was so enthusiastic about Notre Dame out of the gate. A 2-0 lead before the ice is dry, and then just slowly they let that evaporate and did not play well after they came out strong. It kind of surprised me, and for Penn State, you can tell that they're playing desperate. They know that there's no automatic bid for them unless they win the tournament. They probably have to get into the championship game even to be considered. And at that point, I still think it's a long shot, but they played strong and they played like they can. They had some early jitters, but once they calmed down, by far the better team on the ice in that game. I really thought that Penn State was one of the more impressive teams, in that Sunday tournament, because I thought that Minnesota struggled a little. I know we're going to get to them. Minnesota struggled a little. Michigan was impressive. But I thought that Penn State, over the last 55 minutes of that game on Sunday, looked like the Penn State of old. They were as strong as they could play.
And Penn State's going to take on Wisconsin, which had a bye. The other ones, Minnesota and Michigan, are going to take each other on. That should be an epic battle. Michigan really took care of business against Ohio State, and Minnesota needed overtime to get past Michigan State.
You know what I mean? What a performance by Michigan State and their goaltender. I believe it was 50 shots was the final total, but Minnesota survived, and that I think probably gives a little bit of a breath back to the Gopher faithful. They were dying throughout that game, and Michigan, as I mentioned, I thought that they were strong beginning to end. I thought that was a very good playoff game. They handled Ohio State well, didn't give up a lot of shots. When they did, their goaltending was there. I thought that Michigan made a good statement on Sunday, and now they're going to have to take on a Minnesota team that they've beaten, they've lost to. And, this is one of those series where you have to kind of believe that it could go either way. I think that is a highlight game. It gets played tonight, especially going back to back. And, if you win this championship and you're not Wisconsin, you're going back to back to back. That is a lot. So I look at the way this tournament is structured, and this becomes really a premier matchup tonight.
In Hockey East, Boston College is going to take on UMass Lowell. BC had quite a battle on its hands. New Hampshire giving them a pretty good fight in a 3-2 win by BC. UMass Lowell squeaker over Boston University.
Yeah, you know what? I credit Lowell. That's a team that at times this year did not seem like they had anything together, particularly on the back end defensively, goaltending. They actually switched out their goaltender from the first round game back on Wednesday, went with Henry Welsh in the semifinals. He gave up, I think, a goal on his first shot, but then settled in, was pretty solid after that. And their defense was really strong. You're in a tie game against BU, a team that has plenty of offense, and UMass Lowell limits them to 2 shots in the third period. That's pretty impressive. You mentioned BC. They took a 3-0 lead really quickly in that game yesterday against New Hampshire, but New Hampshire had so much fight in them, and they get a couple of goals back in the second period. We're right down to the buzzer, but you see why BC is BC sometimes. You can make a lot out of their offense, and they have so many weapons, but when they had to play defense, when they needed good goaltending, they got it on Sunday, and that's the reason they're moving on. That should be a very good game on Wednesday afternoon. I believe it's a 4:30 start, and that's a kind of one of those battles that BC won both of them in the regular season. I think it was 7-1 and 4-3. The 4-3 game, BC had to come from behind. So it's not like Lowell, really just had to chase the game the whole way. The first night was ugly. Once they got settled in, I think that shows a little bit about this UMass Lowell team. They've got a little bit of guts in them. They've got a little bit of energy. So that should be a good matchup on Wednesday afternoon.
Do the Riverhawks have the intensity to smother BC the way they did BU?
They can. That's one of the things. When they play defense, and it's defense first for them, then they're a good team. If they start getting out of their structure and they start trying to play a run and gun game, try to get into a track meet, I think that's when they would get in trouble. They've got to slow the game down. They've got to bring the game to them. I was talking to Michael Souza, the UNH coach. He talked about it being similar to a football game in that it was kind of all about puck possession and, what type of possession time do you have? And he was talking about football, controlling the ball. It's controlling the puck in hockey. I think that's for Lowell. I think against a team like BC, when they have so many weapons and they have so much speed, you've got to find a way to slow the game down.
The other half of the semifinals are going to have Providence and UMass. UMass got out to an early lead and cruised to a 4-1 win over Northeastern. And then Providence just put a smackdown on UConn.
I was impressed by Providence because they lost that UConn team the week before, and that gave UConn home ice in that game. And Providence went in and really handled them. 6 different goal scorers, strong performance. And UMass similarly, they Northeastern had a little bit of pushback in that game, but for the most part, UMass was in control. And these are two teams. They'll face off in the other semifinal, the primetime game on Wednesday night. And this becomes a heavyweight battle. UMass smacked Providence around a few weeks ago, about a month ago. And that will be fresh in the minds of the Friars, I guarantee you. I think that this is one of those games where it should be UMass entirely on paper, but Providence gets a chance. They're a very good team. And talking to Nate Lehman a couple of weeks ago, he said, I feel like we're just coming around to where we usually are. He said, we're in this situation every year. Just this year, when we get around to it, we're in March and we're not in January. He talked about the fact that, usually about 20-something games in, you're playing your best hockey, but that's usually January. It's not this year. And that was a big issue for the Friars. They're playing their best hockey right now, but they're certainly going to have to step it up and play their best hockey at UMass on Wednesday.
Let's turn to the NCHC. The two matchups are going to be North Dakota and Denver, and Minnesota Duluth with St. Cloud State. Let's talk about Denver. They did what we said they needed to do, which was to get some wins to even be in consideration. They went out to a 4-1 lead over Omaha. Omaha tied it up, and then Denver came back with a game-winning goal in the third period with about 5 minutes left to retake the lead. This makes things a little more precarious for Omaha. We'll get into that later, but then that allows the Pioneers now to take on the Fighting Hawks on North Dakota's home ice. Not an easy feat, but this was a very big win and very important win for Denver.
It was, and you have to wonder, is it too little too late? Who knows? If they get past North Dakota tonight, I think that they, put themselves in a really good position for an at-large bid if they don't win the NCHC championship. I don't think they're there yet, and I think I didn't hear the post-game press conference, but I've heard some quotes that David Carl believes that that win on Saturday puts them in. I don't know if I agree with that. I think that they need to probably get past North Dakota, and then they're a team that's in serious consideration for an at-large bid. They did this shorthanded. If I looked at their line chart right, they had 3 forward lines and 1 extra forward, and I believe that was a converted defenseman who was playing as the 10th forward. I mean, that credit to them. Maybe it wasn't a ton of big name players that were missing from the lineup, but you're missing players, and to play with a short bench in a game like that is difficult. I give them all the credit in the world.
On the other half of that matchup, North Dakota had a pretty convincing win over Miami. But let's look at the other semifinal that's going to happen, Minnesota Duluth and St. Cloud State. To me, this feels like it's been a a boxing match all season, and this is going to be the 15th round, and we'll see who wins by technical knockout. It's had that sort of a back and forth feel all year.
It certainly has. And, now we're playing, here it is. We're, getting the Big Ten and NCHC semifinals tonight. And I love this. This is what, kind of college hockey in this strange time has kind of morphed into, that we're getting these midweek big games. Only thing on TV, there's no college basketball tonight. I'm so excited to sit in front of a TV set tonight, get an iPad going, and probably get a laptop going to make sure I have everything going at the same time, because there's a lot of action. This Minnesota Duluth St. Cloud game, it should be an absolute barn burner. I love the way both of these teams got to this game. Duluth had to survive a real scare from Western Michigan. St. Cloud, a solid game themselves. But, I look at these two teams, and they have had such great battles down the stretch this season, putting them in a semifinal game, knowing that, there's a championship on the line. I think both of them show up tonight. That should be a tilt.
Hats off to Colorado College for the fight they gave St. Cloud State. Less than 4 minutes left in the game when St. Cloud got the game-winning goal. But with only 17 dressed, 16 skaters, and one goalie, which would have been really a weird situation had the goalie gone down. There were all kinds of rules that would kick into play, delay a game, dressing another player, all that stuff. Really, it's been a tough season COVID-wise for Colorado College, and impressive to see them perform that way. We've got 3 other leagues to look at in playoffs, plus the implications of all this for the NCAA. So that's coming up on USCHO's Weekend Review podcast.
This is the USCHO Weekend Review podcast from US College Hockey Online.
Continuing with USCHO Weekend Review, I'm Ed Trefzger alongside Jim Connelly. There was an upset in Atlantic hockey. It had been 6 seasons in a row that Robert Morris had made it to a semifinal round in Atlantic hockey. They were upset at home. 2 overtime games, Friday and Saturday, both went to overtime. Robert Morris winning on Friday, Niagara on Saturday to stay alive. Those meant the 3rd and 4th overtime games of the season between those two teams. And then a 2-0 shutout spoiled with 9 seconds left, and a 2-1 win for Niagara last night. And the Purple Eagles, who had been mired near the bottom of the standings and who had a lot of COVID issues themselves, move on. They will take on AIC. We'll talk about AIC in a little bit. They have been off since January 30th. They're going to host it in Springfield. Canisius swept RIT in 2 games. Army survived Sacred Heart in what turned out to be the 9th longest game in Division I college hockey, a 3-2 win on Saturday. And Coach Brian Riley, very complimentary of the fight Sacred Heart gave them. But that's going to run into a traditional Friday-Saturday Final Four in Atlantic hockey. And Jim, it'll bring up the question whether there's 1 or 2 teams out of that league, and we'll get to that in a little bit. But some entertaining hockey and some real battles, some parity there as teams well down the ranking gave the higher ranked teams a real battle.
Yeah, I'll start with Niagara and Jason Lammers. Listen, that guy, I've known him since he was at Lowell as an assistant, then associate head coach, and did a lot of good things there. A couple of hockey's championships, a Frozen Four. And I swear to God, there's something about certain coaches that they just know how to put teams into the playoffs and be successful. And that, I think, is something that can be said for Niagara. Now they'll face an AIC team that, as you mentioned, is going to be coming off a very long layoff. And it'll be interesting to see how that game plays out on Friday. But, I had talked to Derek Schooley, Robert Morris's coach, during the week. He had some concern. He had concern about Niagara. He knew that they were a tough opponent, that they had played some very good games, tight games throughout the season. And it kind of played out. And, when Niagara got the Saturday win, I kind of worry when you get into a lot of overtimes that sometimes your legs get, taken out from you. And I wondered if Niagara would have the fight back to then, do it again on Sunday. And they did. So I'm very impressed with this Niagara team. As you said, that's one of the strangest things about this season is COVID and what it has done. You've taken some good teams and probably pushed them downward in the standings because they're coming off pauses multiple times in the season. You never get the flow. So when you finally do get healthy, if it happens to coincide with this time of year, the postseason, that I don't want to say it's an advantage. Nobody wants to have a season where it's stops and starts and pauses and you have those issues. But if you're playing well at the right time, and it seems like Niagara is right now, that makes your team all that much more dangerous.
And it's really a story of goaltending for all those teams that are making it to the finals in Atlantic hockey. Canisius, Jacob Barcheski has stood on his head down the stretch. Chad Veltri has been hot for Niagara. Trevin Kozlowski, the senior at Army, has been a terrific netminder for the Black Knights all along. And AIC has a tandem of goaltenders who are all terrific. This could be quite the goalie battle coming up this Friday and Saturday in Springfield. Well, let's turn to the WCHA. Minnesota State, Northern Michigan will be one half of the battle, and the other Bemidji State and Lake Superior. But let's talk about Northern Michigan pulling off the upset on the road.
Where did that come from? I was befuddled a little bit by that one. A good win on Friday to take the lead. Then they get kind of smoked on Saturday. And I said, okay, well, Bowling Green is Bowling Green. They maybe took a night off on Friday, but Northern Michigan to come out on Sunday and play the way that they did and really dominate that game. Very, very impressive to see them moving on. This is a team that, I think I have kind of beaten up a little bit this year, particularly in bracketology. And I've, kind of discounted every win a team any opponent has had, saying that, if you're beating Ferris, you're beating Alabama, Huntsville, you're beating Northern Michigan. Those aren't very good wins. Now I'm realizing the wins teams have against Northern Michigan may be better than I've stated this entire season. So credit to them to get to the semifinals. They're going to play a very tough Minnesota State team. They've got to find ways to score goals, but they did it against Bowling Green, and that's one of those things that if you're playing well this time of year, you're healthy and you're doing the right things, you never know where you'll end up going in these tournaments.
The other matchups in there, really no surprises. Minnesota State, Bemidji State, Lake Superior, none of them had that tough a path, but I think this has to have lifted the NCAA prospects for both Bemidji State and Lake Superior, and we'll get into that in just a little bit also. The other league that has playoffs coming up this weekend, actually Thursday and Saturday, is the ECAC. Colgate will be at St. Lawrence, and that means that's a Thursday game that will require the winner of that to travel about as far as you can in the conference over to Hamden, Connecticut to take on Quinnipiac. We talked last week to Steve Hagwell just before Clarkson ended its season, and things seemed pretty okay. You're going to get the 4 teams who are in. Really, it feels like the league is just kind of limping into this now.
It does. And you know what? I really feel that Quinnipiac needs to play a good game and get out of that championship game and just move on and represent the league. That is where we need to be. I don't want to, I'm not rooting. This is not a rooting interest. Trust me. And I nothing against, Colgate or St. Lawrence. Love their teams, love their coaches. But you get into a situation where whoever goes into Quinnipiac on Saturday, if they were to win, now you're asking, do you put 2 out of 3 teams basically that limp to the finish line into the NCAA tournament? I don't think you can knock Quinnipiac out at this point. So it's one of those situations. It doesn't feel comfortable. And I talked to somebody on the committee and they said, I'm pretty sure it was in the rules that if you needed 3 teams to get an auto bid, so that's what they have left, and they have their 3 teams. But I just feel like this is one of those situations. You said it, limping toward the finish line. I feel for Steve Hagwell. I feel for the 4 participating teams this year. But somehow this doesn't feel right, and here we are. I just hope things go according to script. This is one that if you go off script, it's going to feel uncomfortable come Selection Sunday.
Well, that is coming up this weekend, and I think things are maybe a little more muddled in some ways than they were last week when we looked at this. There's still probably the same teams that are locks, although I think that you have to wonder a little bit now about Boston University. Notre Dame, also a team that may be done, and we got to question Bowling Green. Let's start with BU. How much did that loss in the quarterfinal round hurt the Terriers?
It doesn't help, obviously, but you're 10-4-1. You only played 15 games this year, but you won 10 of them. You beat quality opponents. You beat Boston College. You beat UMass. I feel like BU did what they needed to do, but then a tie and a loss against UMass Lowell, which was the 7th place team in Hockey East, doesn't help. Do I feel that they should still be in? Probably. Yeah. Because I don't know. You're going to have to come up with teams at some point. And, you're in the situation where just mentally, let's go through this, that you have probably one from ECAC, probably one from Atlantic, maybe 2. You probably get 2 from the WCHA. So you got 4 teams. Now you've got 3 leagues that are going to be responsible for filling 12 bids. You just mentioned Notre Dame. I don't see how the Big Ten, without Penn State winning the championship, gets a 4th team in. I don't think you put Notre Dame in right now. So you're now counting on the NCHC or Hockey East to possibly come up with maybe 5 teams. And maybe it's going to be possible in the NCHC. You throw Omaha back into the equation. You maybe put Denver in, you get 5 teams in. But if you eliminate BU in this whole process, Hockey East is going to struggle to find 5 teams. I think you can put Providence in if they can, put up a solid showing or get to the league final. Maybe getting to the semifinals was enough for them. I don't know how we put UConn in at this point. They lose pretty handily in a quarterfinal, despite the fact that I thought they had a solid season. So it's one of these situations, if you're thinking about eliminating Boston University, it's going to be just finding teams at this point, and that might be the struggle. Maybe it becomes Lake Superior. Maybe, maybe Northern Michigan wins the WCHA, and we're not even worried about this. And WCHA suddenly maybe gets 4 teams in the tournament. But I just don't see how it's possible to eliminate BU, despite the fact that they want those last 2 games back. A tie and a loss to a team that was, down at the bottom, toward the bottom of the hockey standings doesn't look good for BU.
You mentioned Notre Dame. Jeff Jackson in his post-game press conference was trying to make the case for the Fighting Irish being in the NCAA tournament. He said, hey, we had 12 games against 3 of the top 6 teams in the country, Michigan, Minnesota, Wisconsin, but Notre Dame went 4-7-1 through those. Not terrible, but that means you weren't totally successful against them. The one that really perplexes me in the stretch here is Bowling Green. They kind of stumbled a little bit in the late part of the regular season, and then to lose this playoff series. They played more games than anybody in college hockey this year, and they started out so well. They had 2 huge road wins over Quinnipiac. Boy, it feels like they're going to be disappointed, but boy, they're not out of it yet. But still, it seems difficult to get them into this right now.
I agree with you. I mean, you mentioned most games played, a lot of wins. I get that. But the stumbles down the stretch, and we saw it counted on the women's side, and people weren't happy that, Minnesota didn't play well down the stretch, and thus they ended up being left out of the women's tournament. I don't know if that is going to happen on the men's side, but I go back to the end. 2 losses, obviously, to Northern Michigan this weekend. Lost to Lake Superior back in mid-February. They got swept by Minnesota State. So you're talking about playing the best team, and they didn't get any wins out of that. They got swept by Bemidji State. They lost a game to Bemidji in early January. I mean, they were on such a run. I think they were at one point like 11-12-1. But then it's that kind of litany of losses. And where were their wins in that time? They beat Northern twice. Now let's see, Northern is maybe better than we think. They swept Michigan Tech. They get a 0-0 tie against Northern that'll win. And then they get 2 against Alabama Huntsville. No disrespect to that team, but they just weren't the team that everybody hoped they would be this year. They didn't have a good season. So the wins that they are totaling down the stretch were all against what ended up being, for the most part, the bottom half of the WCHA. Their losses against the top half. It's one of those things. I think sometimes you have to prove that you can beat the best teams in your conference, and down the stretch, Bowling Green doesn't pass that test.
Providence, you made the case for them. What about Penn State? It still looks like they've got to win the Big Ten to get in. They just, even with one more win, say they beat Wisconsin and lose to either Michigan or Minnesota, that's still not going to be enough to get them in, I don't think.
I agree. So I'm going to go through their quality wins. A good quality win, a 9-5 win over Michigan back in December. After that, a win against Wisconsin, a 5-4 win in late January. A win against Notre Dame, two counting yesterday. That doesn't do much for me right now. I'm not that high on Notre Dame. So they just don't have the quality wins. They had so many losses right there to start the season. I think they started 0-5. So, and that was against the good competition. So they got swept by Minnesota. They got swept by Wisconsin. Then they lose to Michigan. They come back and beat Michigan 9-5 in the second night. But I agree. The resume's not there for me on Penn State yet. And if they beat Wisconsin tonight, and maybe you make a case for them, I think a lot of this is going to come down to, do we have to fill a hole at the end of the tournament? And if we do, who are we filling it with? If you have 15 teams that are pretty easy to put in, and then you've got teams like Providence, Notre Dame, Penn State, UConn, as kind of that last bid that you're trying to put in. Denver, well, let's throw Denver and Omaha in there possibly as well. I don't see Penn State as having the resume. So I think they are still in a position they have to win the Big Ten tournament.
You're going to get down to 6 auto bids and probably 12 teams in that are going to be a lock. And then you're going to have to do some juggling in comparison for the bottom 4, unless there are some upsets in there. AIC is another one to talk about. They will have gone 48 days without a game when they play on Friday. If they lose in the semis or the finals, the worst they're going to be is 13-4 or 14-4. And also let's talk about Army. Army, if they make it to the championship game, will have won 13 games in a row. And if they lose to AIC, assuming that's the matchup, they will have lost to a team that will have gone 15-3. It's more than a sentimental choice to put Army in there. Army has done what it needs to do against the schedule it was able to put together. If you're down to like 4 teams and you're comparing maybe a third or fourth team in the WCHA, maybe a fourth or fifth team in Hockey East or NCHC, do you have to weigh an AIC or an Army as a second bid for Atlantic hockey? I think you have to look at it seriously. I'm not saying the committee is going to do it, but it's not just a joke or a throwaway. It's going to be a serious decision against a team that has played very well this season.
I agree. And, it's easy to forget about Army. And that's a big fault of everybody, including myself, because I didn't even throw them in that little conversation I was just having internally in my head. And the reality is that Army has done everything they could do with their schedule, played extremely well down the stretch. I think that you're right. It's possible that if they were to say lose in the Atlantic Hockey Finals to AIC and you're looking for that 16th team, why not make a case for them? They're going to have a more impressive down the stretch resume. I know that's not supposed to be a criteria, but listen, it's any criteria is a criteria this year. People's subjectivity is going to come into the decision. So I look at it, they are going to have that down the stretch resume of playing extremely well in the final 2 months of the season. I could see it. I could see them getting the nod over, say, maybe a Bowling Green team, maybe a Lake Superior team, maybe UConn that you can't put in. Do you put Army in instead? Yeah, it's totally possible.
They've had terrific goaltending. We mentioned Trevin Kozlowski, but also their junior, Colin Billick, has got 18 goals on the season. He's averaging almost 1.2 points per game. The only goal scorer who's had more than him is Cole Caulfield. He's got one ahead of Sampo Ranta, the hero in overtime for Minnesota. This is a guy who could even be in the Hobey Baker finalist ranks. So it's a good team. Yeah, competition hasn't been as strong, but again, you play the schedule you can. And, if you want to talk schedules, what do you do with Quinnipiac, for example? Colgate and St. Lawrence are decent teams, but they are not among the top teams in the country. If you want to start criticizing schedules, you have to look at the WCHA as well. So I think you need to include them in the equation. And I would not want to be the guy in the room, but I think what's going to happen is when the committee gets to the final 3-4 spots, whatever it is, they're going to have to look at all these teams. And I think if they look at the criteria they are given, they're still not going to be able to make a decision. Then it comes to the eye test. Well, what's in the eye test? Is it a hunch on what people look like? Yeah. Is it also using some criteria that aren't on the list? I think they're going to have to do that. What did the team do in the last 10 games? What was the goal differential against their opponents? How strong has their goaltending been? All kinds of things like that are non-criteria that they're going to have to weigh in there to find some way to separate these teams.
And I hope, Ed, that that's the process. I hope that it's more of a long, drawn-out process as opposed to maybe a lobbying initiative. That's what I don't want to see, is this becoming lobbying, that, you've got commissioners that are going to their coaches who are representing it, then they're going to whoever the other member is from their league that's on the committee. And then, you've got the advisory committee, they give their opinion, they do a lot of lobbying. And then next thing you know, they step out. Now you've got the committee and, are people on the committee lobbying? And, I want this to be, it's going to be a weird process. It's going to be what basketball goes through every year. I want at the end of this to come out and say, listen, they had tough decisions to make, but I'm okay with them. I don't want it to look like a bunch of lobbyists went into a room, from various conferences, and the most powerful voices won. That would be the one thing that would bother me the most about this. So we're a week away. The process by this time next week will be over, and we'll hopefully have some answers. But I hope that, as you mentioned, that it is a long conversation, that it's not just a bunch of shouting and the loudest voice wins.
Well, with that, we'll wrap up this first edition of the week of Weekend Review. We're going to have a midweek weekend review, if that makes any sense. But there are games going on this week of importance, and Jim and I will catch up to take a look at that and see what the implications are from those games. For Jim Connelly, I'm Ed Trefzger, and we'll catch you next time.
This has been the USCHO Weekend Review Podcast, a production of US College Hockey Online. Visit uscho.com/podcasts to listen or subscribe.